Welcome to Whips in the Dungeon. We have an opportunity to do an extended, or to take an extended look at a brand new book. Well, I say it's brand new, it came out in April. But recently, Robert Dante sent me a signed copy of his newest book, Bullwhip, the Dante Method. And I did a brief review on this book on the Leather Journey, and you may have seen that. This is going to be a little more extended review because it's really a comparative review. We aren't just looking at the Dante method. We're going to compare it to Whips in the Dungeon, which we could call it Dex's method, but it's a different approach, okay? So just in brief, to put the Dante method in a nutshell, I would say it's really not exclusively his method. It's the common method that I find most whip instructors taking when they teach basic whips. The very first crack that's taught is a circus crack or a cattleman's crack, and then the next crack that's taught is an overhand flick. Okay, and then he has a section where he goes into sport cracking. I'm not going to deal on, go into much detail on that because the focus of Whips in the Dungeon, the channel, is on dungeon play. So I really only want to talk about parts of this book that would relate to dungeon play. So for cracking, basic cracking, it's a very good book, and I would recommend it for people that are interested in learning how to crack a whip. And it's short and it's to the point, so it has a lot of pluses. Some of the minuses of it, he has a brief section on types of whips. Whips in the Dungeon also covers types of whips. We cover all types of whips, from floggers to cats to quirts to dragon tails, signal whips, snake whips, bull whips, stock whips. Robert only covers bull whips, signal whips, and stock whips in his types of whips. I would say in the dungeon there are more whips that are pertinent than that. And the big whip that he omits is the snake whip, which is what I'm throwing today. It's a little 2-foot snake by Peter Jack. Perfect for house parties, perfect for small boutique dungeons. What I like about the snake whip, and that I don't like that he didn't include it, because I love the snake and I throw it every dungeon set, is a signal whip's finished with a cracker and it finishes on point where you point it. The snake whip, because it has a fall, it has better flow. And I like the beauty and the grace and the rollout of a snake, and I like that flow. And I find that if you throw it with finesse, you can throw it every bit as much accurately as a signal whip, and you just don't get that kind of flow out of a signal. So I teach signal whips, I own signal whips, but when I go in the dungeon, I throw a snake whip and a bull whip. Primarily because the snake has good flow, and aside from the stiff handle, that flow is very much like the flow I get out of a bull whip. So snakes aren't in this book. He takes those two cracks, the circus crack and the overhand flick, and those are the first two cracks you learn. When you compare those in dungeon play, which is really what Whips in the Dungeon's all about, the only one that has immediate direct correlation to dungeon play is this overhand flick, because you throw it and it rolls out and it finishes where you point it. Okay, so we're pointing at the shoulders, or we're pointing at the butt, or wherever it is on the body we're pointing. The whip rolls out and finishes. Okay, and you could throw that flick forehanded, and you could throw that flick backhanded. Okay, or you can turn your hand over, palm toward the target, and you could throw that When I turn it over though, it's no longer a flick, it becomes a cutback or a cattleman's crack. So to get that to the target, I have to slow that crack way down to get that whip to roll out and finish on target. And that's why I say the circus crack should be moved back a little bit if your focus is dungeon play, and not necessarily be one of the first whips that you throw. So what's the difference? The difference in the Dante method and the Dex method is we take an adult learning approach to throwing a whip. Adults learn new skills quicker by relating them to skills they already have, okay? So the first whip that we learn to throw in the dungeon is a flogger. And we basically learn to gather all the tails together and throw it like a bow and arrow. We can come off the shoulder with it. We can throw it horizontally, or we can throw it in a forward figure 8. Okay, and we have hours and hours and hours of mileage throwing a flogger that way. So we apply those same 4 methods to throwing a cat, to throwing a quirt, to throwing a dragon tail, to throwing a galley whip, to throwing every class of whip and type of whip that we can throw in the dungeon. So then when we move to a single tail and we're throwing a snake whip or a bull whip, we have a bow and arrow. And remember again, the focus of whips in the dungeon is throwing short whips. Short whips meaning bull whips that are 4 foot and shorter, snake whips that are 3 foot and shorter, signal whips that are 3 and 4 foot long, dragon tails that are 3 and 4 foot long. So throwing a short whip, you can get to contact dungeon play quicker if you relate that to flogging techniques than if you relate that to basic cracking techniques, okay? So bow and arrow, over the shoulder, here we go. Horizontal, and the forward figure 8. Those are the 4 techniques, okay? Now, if we could freeze frame, that's a fancy word, if we could freeze frame this dynamic motion in time, okay, and I could stall that whip right here before it rolls out. If it stalls for a moment in time, I could analyze it as a bow and arrow. But I could also say if it froze for that moment in time, it's an overhand flick, okay? So for that moment in time on the forehand side of the forward figure 8, I'm setting up an overhand flick, which is the first meaningful crack that Dante teaches in his approach. When I move it over here and I stall it, for that moment in time, again, it's a bow and arrow. It's also a backhand flick. So what we've accomplished by using this forward figure 8 is we've incorporated a forehand flick and a backhand flick, all by relating it to a flogging technique, the forward figure 8. And we're not worried about cracking because we're doing sensation play in the dungeon. So a lot of our play is subsonic. It's at control puff level 1. Remember, control puff 1 is the slowest speed you can roll out that rolling loop and have it finish on target without gravity affecting its accuracy and causing the whip to finish below the target. So that's control puff 1. You throw it a little harder, control puff 2. Throw it harder, control puff 3. Throw it harder, control puff 4. Throw it a little harder, control puff 5. Somewhere around control puff 6 or 7, the whip is just going to naturally crack. You don't have to worry about learning how to crack the whip. It's going to naturally crack, okay? At the point it cracks, around a control puff 7, then beyond that, you're playing supersonic and you're playing on the other side of the sound barrier. So remember again, anytime we pick up a whip, we're doing edge play. We're working with speeds that are a little, depends on pressure and temperature and altitude, but anywhere between 761 miles per hour and 767 miles per hour. I think in Robert's book, his crack is at 761. My crack's a little faster. Mine cracks at 767. But regardless of which speed it cracks at, the point is it's edge play. You need to respect the whip and throw it with care and consideration, and realize that the brave soul that's standing on the other end of your whip is trusting you to keep them safe in play from start to finish and have a good journey and a good endorphin rush from the play that you're doing. So 2 different approaches: a basic cracking approach in bullwhip, the Dante method, or a whips in the dungeon approach that is really based more on standard techniques used in throwing all classes of short whips in the dungeon. Which one is going to get you into playing contact play in the dungeon quicker? If your goal is basic cracking, then read the Dante method. If your goal is to play in the dungeon and to not spend 2 years learning how to make a circus crack finish on target, then take the whips in the dungeon approach, okay? If you have a goal of doing both, then buy both books and read both books. They're both excellent books. Robert's book is very well written. It's very short. It's a good read. I highly recommend it. My book's a little bit longer, but Moodstone made sure it was very well written too, and it's an equally good read. I've got another book coming out shortly. Moodstone just finished the edits on it. As soon as I get the corrections made and the photos selected, then look for me doing a pitch and promoting it on this channel. As always, thanks for your patience in watching Whips in the Dungeon. Ring the bell, subscribe, and consider becoming a channel member. Your love and support on small channels like this is vitally important. You might consider joining my Patreon group. That helps support the monthly whip practice, and it also helps support my efforts in teaching whips and sharing my knowledge with other groups around the country as we continue our journey into leather.